Wonderful. Okay, well, good evening and welcome to everyone to the AEVA's latest webinar titled Unpacking the Public Charging Experience. And before we get started, I'd like to first acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, the people whose land I live on, and would like to give thanks for the care and nurturing of the home, which obviously provided food and shelter and entertainment and knowledge for 65,000 years. And I often say this, but I think that's really the definition of sustainability. If you can live that long on one piece of land, you're doing something right. I encourage everyone to think about where you reside and who was there for sort of 60 odd millennia before you, and familiarise yourself with the names and places, customs and values. Before we get into the webinar, I'd like to remind our members of some key events and dates coming up, most notably the AEVA conference, and the gala dinner on the 3rd of November, the EV Expo, which is on the 4th and 5th of November. We've got our AGM, our annual general meeting will be on the Saturday night of that weekend, which is the 4th of November. And we're going to have an AEVA members workshop on the 6th of November, the following Monday. So giving you plenty of advance notice, you can plan your trips over to Western Australia. That'll be great. Tickets will go on sale for the conference and dinner. There will be a fat discount for AEVA members as a package there as well. So we're really keen to see as many people come over to the West as possible. By the way, sponsorship opportunities and exhibitor opportunities are still going. If you'd like to know more, just visit www.theevexpo.com. You can find the links off our website, of course, and you can check out some of the sponsorship and exhibitor prospecti. Either way, it should be a good, fun event, and it'll certainly be the biggest EV show that Western Australia has seen since the last Electricana, I think. So tonight we're going to be talking about a hot topic, so hot that it ranked number 2 on our members' survey of issues that the association really ought to get active on. Public EV charging. Oh, by the way, number 1 was vehicle emission standards, and yep, we're onto that too. So yeah, public EV charging, and when it works, it's mint, and when it doesn't, it can be incredibly frustrating. So as I noted on the flyer that went out, more Australians are buying electric vehicles. The demands on public charging infrastructure are going to grow as well. But the public charging experience in Australia has been mixed. A lot of our members report frustrations when things aren't working. Sometimes it's something really simple, like, oh, there's a bit of a bug with the screen. Other times the charger's just flat out not working and it's been offline for months. So major frustrations, and, you know, we really need to get this right. So our panel consists of those who've been working in the EV charging world for a long time, whether it's the user interface or integrating hardware and software, rolling out chargers in remote locations. These guys have got lots of experience. So we have on our panel today, we have Tim Washington, CEO and co-founder of JetCharge, Australia's largest EV charging technology business. Tim was the co-founder of Chargefox, doesn't work for Chargefox anymore. It's a habit I'll have to break out of. Obviously, Chargefox is now the country's largest EV charging network, and Tim is also the chair of the Electric Vehicle Council. Dunstan Power is the co-founder of and director of Versinetic, an EV charging consultancy based in the UK. He spends a fair bit of time in Australia too, which is always great to see. Sam Moran, who is the regional manager for Noodoe Charging Solutions, a firm specialising in charging operation systems and hardware integration. We've got Jagrup Gill, who's the co-founder and CEO at WeVolt, a startup based in Perth, developing an integrated app for EV charging, and Kyle Pearce, who is a co-founder of Analo, which is a startup focusing on increasing the accessibility, convenience and functionality of EV charging, parking and navigation. We'll start off with our speakers having the opportunity to give a brief introduction to themselves and the roles that they've had in the EV charging world, and a little bit of their experiences. And after this, I'll lead a bit of a discussion on the nature of public charging, what needs to be done to make it better and certainly go more smoothly. As always, the Q&A chat box is open and we'll try and read your questions as the opportunities present. Sometimes I will introduce a question as it pops up where I can. Otherwise, I will immediately throw to, I'll throw to Jag because you're at the top corner of my screen.
Thanks, Chris. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be among the panelists. I'm really honored to be here. About my background, my journey, and I think that's also the VVOL's, how our company came to be, is a bit of an odd one. So it all started when I bought my first electric vehicle, which was last year. And, you know, the drive was amazing, you know, smooth and quite experienced like no other car that I've owned before. And it definitely felt like a step into the future. But I quickly discovered, like most current or like people who are currently buying EVs, a hurdle that basically tainted this fantastic experience for me, and which was like, how do you find a charging station when you're not charging at home? And like many EV owners, I downloaded and juggled multiple apps to locate the nearest chargers, you know, especially when you're planning trips down south. The fact that I had to use multiple apps to figure out like the whole experience, while my driving experience was an upgrade, the whole refilling the tank felt like a significant downgrade. And I knew there had to be a better way. And that's when the idea for VVolt was born. And I've since surrounded myself with people. I'm not a very technical person myself, but I've surrounded myself with people who are the technical people. I would have really liked our Chief Technical Officer, Moran, to be here tonight, but unfortunately he couldn't be. So look, we are a passionate team of developers here in Perth, and we are working on a software solution, which basically the aim is to bring there are a lot of isolated, underutilized charges, and we want to bring them together and make them accessible through a seamless app. So I'm really interested in hearing from the community what their experience has been and what are some of the pain points that we may not have thought of yet.
Cool. And how about you, Sam? Tell us about yourself, mate.
Mate, so I'm the country manager for Noodoe here in Australia. And look, a little bit of background on Noodoe. Not to give too much of a plug, but so Noodoe is a global charging network platform provider. So we power a lot of the charging networks globally. We operate in about 13 countries and counting so far. A very big presence in North America, across Asia, and we're growing obviously here in Australia and in the region in APAC and across Europe and the Middle East at the moment. So I think what drew me to Noodoe was I think particularly when it comes to talking about, you know, user experience with electric vehicle charging. And I think Jack had a great comment there about, you know, the multiple apps that we all have to carry. And look, I'm the same. I'm an EV driver and I travel around for expos and all that sort of stuff as just as most of us in the call, I would imagine. And I think what Noodoe offer is an appless experience. So essentially, with a QR code on the front of a charger, we enable a mobile web user experience. So you don't, and it integrates with Apple Pay or Android Pay on your phone. And it's as simple as just scan, pay, charge. So it's almost as good as tapping your EFTPOS card. But we kind of, you know, there's a couple of reasons why we sort of, we don't really recommend offering credit card and EFTPOS solutions, because we can't contact you when your charging session's finished. And let's say, for example, we've got an occupancy fee set up to start accruing when you finish your charging session. We want to be able to contact you before we start billing you and that sort of stuff. So with the mobile web solution, we grab your phone number so we can contact you. We do have a mobile app as well, depending on your flavor. But, you know, I love that whole seamless experience. You can just walk up to it and use it like you would any other machine. So, and look, you know, I guess a bit of a focus on software and solving some of these problems that are going to come up down the track. And I guess for me, looking at Noodoe's track and what we've got, and I've got to be careful what I say out loud, because there's certain things that I'm told I can't discuss publicly, but I do get excited. And, you know, some of the things that that are coming down the track in terms of in enhancing that experience, like, you know, a lot of people can compare the experience driving a Tesla and using a supercharger. Well, we've got, you know, not to get too technical, but we've got auto charge, plug and charge, and the new version of OCPP 2.0 that's coming out. And we're currently working with OEMs to bring all of that under support, so that once that happens, you know, the client's using our network, you connect your vehicle in, and it'll automatically authenticate and authorize your payment method that's already saved in your account with the vehicle. So we're, you know, again, there's a couple of little, you know, not quite the seamless user experience that we all hope to achieve, but we're getting there. The plans are in place and the technology is coming. It's just getting all of these different OEMs, charging providers, hardware operators together to create that seamless user experience, which is kind of what gets me excited. I've got a bit of a background with IBM and you know, looking at what we're doing with EVs and the technologies. It's an exciting space to be.
Sure. Awesome. And Kyle, do you want to tell us a bit about Analo?
So was that me?
Yeah,
Great. Yeah. So yeah, I suppose Anelo, the concept behind Anelo is really draws upon both my co-founder and my background in architecture and economics. And we're kind of just looking at the future of urban planning, or me personally, and vehicle transport. And it all came down to efficiency and how EV and maybe potentially things like AI and stuff can be incorporated into one system, and how that could really lead us to a much more sustainable and equitable future for everyone. So as we've discussed, we have seen a great adoption of EV in Australia, unfortunately probably lacking the rest of the world a little bit, but it is happening. So our thoughts are, how do we create a more kind of succinct and easy transition to EV? And that really comes down to a few stages, but ultimately the first one is creating an aggregate platform where the atomized nature of different providers is all accessible in one location, and then leading on to integration with vehicles themselves and allowing that process to become more synonymous with each other as opposed to atomized. And that's a short and long of it, really. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that's definitely a keen interest in making the process a whole lot easier. So I'll throw to you, Tim, someone who's got a fair bit of experience with rolling out chargers around the country. Would you like to introduce yourself and what you're up to lately?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Tim Washington. Look, we're rolling out charging infrastructure. I guess that's what I've been up to lately. I guess particularly relevant to the WA is the WA Electric Highway, and which, you know, introduces, I guess you would call, the new generation of EV charging gear, being the Kempower stuff, which has actually secured incredible kind of market share very quickly globally. And I think that's what happens when you see reliable gear. You just end up having a lot of those around, and as a result, I think they've done really well. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. There's really not much I can add to everyone else. I think we have gone through most of it. I guess the only things I would say is that, one, almost everything is easy to do when you don't have scale, and almost everything is incredibly hard to do at scale. And so whilst there are always going to be lots of really fantastic ideas, one of the really interesting things I've found is that Australia doesn't have a habit of just looking overseas and going, hey, they've actually gone through all of that, let's not try and reinvent the wheel. And that's particularly the case when I look at all of the debates we have around apps, around credit cards, around all of that. And I think we just basically just need to follow what the rest of the world is doing and not be too, I guess, inventive, because we can probably put our efforts elsewhere. And the second thing I would say, and I think this will come up a lot in the Q&A, is that I almost guarantee you that every single thing that every single EV driver, and I've been driving EVs for a long time as well, 10 years, almost everything that you guys complain about rightly 99% of the time, the networks know. And like, I would say that, yeah, occasionally I do get one where I'm like, fuck, that's a really good point. I haven't thought of that. I do get that. But most of the time we're like, yep, we don't. Add it to the 500 things we're trying to deal with.
One more tweet, that'll fix it.
And I think the fundamental kind of issue for the public charging industry is in Australia is that it is an unprofitable industry. The Tesla supercharging network, regardless of what you read in the media about it being worth $100 billion, is unprofitable. And so if it wasn't for the fact that they sold cars, it would have gone. So, and putting that light, I think that's probably where you see most of the issues arise, which is why it's no surprise that globally there are very, very, very few at scale charging networks that aren't owned by oil companies, large multinational electrical companies, very few. And I think the same thing will probably play out in Australia as well. There's room for plenty of players, but it requires a lot of money and 10 to 15 year time horizons.
Cool. Yeah, we're very much looking forward to lots of perspectives on these things. I'll just quickly read one of the questions, and it's popped up in the chat box. Was the Chargefox network actually bigger than the Tesla charging network?
In terms of number of plugs, yes.
Cool. Awesome. Cool. Well, speaking about looking elsewhere around the world and why can't we just do what they do, I'll throw to Dunstan, who's got plenty of experience with the world of EV charging in the UK.
Hi. Thanks for the intro. So Versinetic, we manufacture electronics and software for EV chargers, and our experience really goes back to public networks with the London Olympics in 2012. So at that point, we put 120 chargers in at the Olympic venues, and Transport for London at the time put a spec out saying, look, we want chargers to be able to do this, that and the other. And they wanted to be able to put 250,000 vehicle details in. I don't think there were 250,000 EVs in the world probably at that time, but most of the other specs were like what the current smart charging standards are. And I mean, really, the issues you've got in Australia, and I heard a lot of these when I did the Fully Charged show in Sydney earlier in the year, and really the issues are very, very much the same issues as in Europe. The UK is about number 3 in Europe in terms of public charging infrastructure. We have all the same issues, unreliability, payment issues, but fundamentally there aren't enough chargers because the growth in EV sales is really outstripping the infrastructure, and there's a whole loads of reasons for that which we can delve into later in the talk. But at the moment, I just want to share one slide with you, and just show something a bit different. So, and that's just to really show that chargers don't all have to be metal or plastic boxes. We've actually built a charger into a tree. I would say no trees were hurt in the making of this, but unfortunately that's not true. But yeah, so this is really for heritage sites. So we've got interest from the National Trust in the UK, and also for sort of heritage village sites. But yeah, it's really just to say that I've seen other sorts of solutions along these lines as well at some of the European shows, just to say that chargers might be appearing in public spaces in a slightly different form in the future.
Charging a leaf, no less.
It's charging a leaf. Yeah, that was my old EV. Yeah. Thanks.
Cool, awesome. Well, as the only other panelist, I'll provide a perspective from that of an EV driver and charger, and fair to say most of my experience has fortunately been quite positive. I do most of my charging at home or at work, mostly at home, And I also have had experience with installing a fast charger in a remote location, and I could write a book on the town of Ravensthorpe. So then the difficulties, the hardware difficulties that we encounter are pretty much universal. But again, the West Australia network has some unique challenges. So well, thank you everybody for coming along, and I'll just quickly jump to a quick question here by John. Why are there not more plug and charge options like other countries are doing? So we need a simple option, not using multiple apps or RFID. So for those who don't know, the plug and charge is where your car has some kind of an identifier built into the charge port. You plug in, it just starts charging, and the bill arrives in the mail. Sam, are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, look, so that's a bit of a technical question, and I'll try not to lose anyone here, but there's a couple of different protocols which enable that kind of functionality. One is termed auto charge, which is a kind of a stopgap measure via a protocol called ISO 15118. And the long-term permanent solution for that will be incorporated with the OCPP protocol, which is known as plug and charge commonly. So that sort of capability requires OEMs, and we're working with a few of them at the moment that we'll probably have announcements out over the next 3 months to bring that under support. So that requires those OEMs to perform testing with all the different hardware companies and the platform and network operators to enable that to work seamlessly. So if you imagine, Tesla can accomplish that very, very easily because it's a proprietary solution. They know exactly, they can do their testing in-house. There's no NDAs, there's no commercial agreements in place required. So they can just, employ that. Now, obviously it's been in place for many years now, and it's a very good solution. I drive a Tesla Model 3 Performance myself, so I've used the feature myself many times. But look, particularly from a software development perspective, as a platform provider, it's one of the things that are on the very top of our list to ensure that we're working very closely with all the manufacturers to bring that under support. But I sort of touched on that a little bit earlier. We've got to have all of those parties in line and everyone willing to work together to ratify that protocol and ensure that that works seamlessly, so that we don't have that patchy sort of user experience where it works on some and not others. We need it to work first time, every time, very seamlessly and automatically almost. And also that requires, from an OEM perspective, to have a very robust and secure system whereby your payment details are secured and saved with your account with the vehicle. And look, a lot of older models will not have that capability. So we're always going to need some form of authorizing your payment at the device, and I think that's why we love our, the Atlas experience with the Scan Pay Charge, because obviously, ideally, in a perfect world, we won't need those solutions or those payment methods down the track. Plug your cable in, and whether it's auto charge in the meantime or plug and charge, off you go. But for the old vehicles and maybe some of the custom conversions that, we see at the AEVA Expo, and I'm looking forward to later this year, those might be a bit of a tricky one. We'll probably still have to use
legacy
payment methods as well. But I hope that's sort of answered your question there. But
yeah, it also explains the nature of the technology and how trying to get agreement amongst OEMs is challenging at the best of times. A good question here by Ben Elliston. Perhaps I might direct it to you, Tim. Recently, a major charging network suffered a widespread outage due to a comms fault. The question is, why don't chargers sort of fail open, so that you can at least use them, albeit for free, so that there's minimum inconvenience?
I don't know why all charging networks don't do that. Few reasons. The first is because different charging hardware does it differently. Not all charging hardware is able just to switch protocol when it loses comms. That's the first reason. Second reason is some owners of charging infrastructure is greedy and they don't want to use that shit if they can't bill you. Third reason is because some people just don't even think about it in the commissioning process. Many reasons for that. But I will be clear and to say, look, having connected charging stations is really important, especially for fault rectification It's really required. I mean, we tend to have a policy where, like, and this is when I say we, I don't mean Chargefox. I mean, when we deploy charging infrastructure, we certainly encourage that, especially for critical infrastructure, especially for regional infrastructure. Ironically, the less a charging station is used, almost the more reliable it needs to be. Because if you're really like in the middle of nowhere, you really need that thing to work. And yeah, definitely don't want a comms fault.
Yeah, that sounds like Raven's
blocking that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Michael White had a question here. Ampol Meovac partnership, genius, epic challenge, or doomed to fail? I'm not personally all that familiar with the Ampol Meovac partnership. Maybe others are.
Yeah, that got announced today. Basically, Ampol is going to put in free charging stations into Meovac centres. Meovac's done that with a number of players. Ampol's the latest. And so the retail centres are basically going, hey, we have these car parks, maybe we can extract more rent. And so every single kind of shopping kind of centre is doing that. And the biggest question for me is, will they continue to do that, or will they go down the Walmart road and basically go, maybe the only thing that matters for charging infrastructure is land, and maybe we have the only thing that matters, and therefore maybe we should do it, because there's no secret sauce really in in kind of like charging networks. They use third-party hardware. Much of the software is white labeled, though they probably don't want you to know that, and they use third-party people to deploy it. So the only thing that matters is land. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of gestured to suggest that free charging, roll my eyes a bit. It's fraught, and as an organisation, we've generally said it's not a good idea, especially an arrangement where someone buys a $170,000 EV with free charging, and then they drive around the corner and use the free charging and block it up so others can't use it. It really should be discouraged, but free market and all. So, okay, well, this is probably a good question for you then, Dunstan, given your experience with hardware in the UK and hardware that from time to time wasn't all that reliable. How best can we manage hardware reliability and maintenance? Like, what's the ultimate God move there?
Actually, I'm just in the UK. I looked at a study just before this talk, and depending what area you're in at the moment, there's between about 18 and 30% of public chargers out of service. I mean, it's a really bad situation, and there's a bunch of reasons for this. So. But, you know, fundamentally, it seems to mostly come down to finance and how the finance is set up on the network. So the problem we've had is where we've had like capital finance for installing chargers, but then they've not had ongoing finance for actually the ongoing maintenance. And so what happens is they put in a beautiful £50,000 charger, and then no one services it, and the sort of issues people see obviously turning up, it just says out of service. I mean, comms problems are quite a big one, despite us having a pretty robust cellular network. We get vandalism issues as well, but I think they're fairly minor. Certainly on DC chargers, it's more the sort of on-street AC chargers. But there's also a bit of a lack of skill shortages. So I don't know about Australia, but certainly at the moment, hiring in the UK is pretty difficult. So there's sort of lack of people. But fundamentally, what we've seen in the UK, when we look at some of the networks where they've got their funding right and their business model right, they actually have a much higher uptime than other areas. So it is quite geographical, and it is quite network based, and fundamentally it comes down to that. Getting the money in place at the outset for whoever's putting it in to actually cover maintenance and to assume that these things are going to need maintenance.
There's a quality of hardware component to that as well. So the more better built the equipment is, the less likely it is to need work, but everything will benefit from
Yeah,
maintenance.
that's true. Yeah, I mean, that's true, and certainly, but there's some of the sort of quite big brand chargers we see as a lot of issues with. You know, it's Siemens, sort of BP, Pulse ones. You know, it's not necessarily companies who haven't got deep pockets themselves, and you'd expect to have high quality standards. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember back when the RAC electric highway went in back in 2015, the Circontrol Trio chargers were designed so that the main rectifier diodes were attached to the same heatsink as that of the IGBTs. So all of the heat that was being generated through the process of charging was being sunk straight into these diodes, which failed after about an hour of heavy charging. And so there was this sort of campaign to go around and replace all the diodes in all of the network. So that was obviously a design issue that they've since rectified with modular power systems. But could we have seen it coming? Well, perhaps.
I mean, certainly having the chargers modular is important. I mean, if we're talking about DC chargers, being able to swap inverters in and out and independent of the rest of it, and I think that's mostly how they're built up. But on the AC chargers, I mean, on home chargers, there's this massive race to the bottom in terms of cost, and that's producing a lot of quality issues with home charging. But on public charging, there's more margin in it. You shouldn't have that issue, and a lot of it is more about just abuse in the market, and then lack of maintenance once they've actually been installed.
Yeah, Tim, you're about to.
I was just going to say, I think Chris, you're absolutely right in that we do have to draw a line between maintenance and just really bad hardware. Like the thing, like, and I will say, and I will defend, I would say, like the early hardware, a lot of which is still in Australia, because like the entire industry is learning. Nobody came to this with a book and said, this is exactly how you should do it. It's everyone's learning. And when we built the first 350 kilowatt network in Australia, there were 2 suppliers globally to choose from, ABB and Tritium, and we put both of those brands into the network. And many of the users will have used those and know some of the issues that we face with them. But back then, you know, you go, well, why did Chargefox choose those 2 brands? It's because they were the only 2 brands available globally. And so, but at the end of the day, as someone who kind of sells and installs and has run charging networks, you really do expect hardware to work, and then you expect it to work ongoing, and then with the right maintenance, you expect long life out of them. But you don't expect to install it and then for it to break immediately. And then you don't expect it to fix it and then break again and again and again. That's not a matter of maintenance. That's just a matter of poor hardware.
Yeah, for sure. And logistics as well. Like if you got a spare part and it takes 3 months for it to be reported, well, that's a comms issue as well, you know. I might throw to Kyle. Are you guys working on a better way of reporting in real time issues and some sort of more reliable strategy to get service personnel out to fix these things?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we're looking more on the user side of things, not necessarily respondents to the machine, but more informing the user of the status of things as they are. And I guess ultimately it's really, we're trying to create collaboration between multiple providers so that, you know, users can access that information at any given point and then make their decisions as they go about their day. And that's really what we think is, you know, one part of this issue is obviously there's that hardware drama that everyone's trying to resolve, but there's also the user that just needs to be informed and need to understand what the situation is. And I think that's where our role is to try and be that informant essentially. And that does require some collaboration, which we're hoping to achieve. So, yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. I'm just noticed a comment here from Megan Taylor. She said she spent from 10:15 a.m. to 5 p.m. locked onto an EV charger last week, eventually released by something that was done at the EVN, something to do with Chatamo. So now the old Chatamo has an issue. It happened once before 3 years ago on Chargefox. Was it not possible to unlock the car from the car end despite our best efforts? Your thoughts? Well, I can personally speak from experience that my Ionic had a little actuator that locks the plug in position so that someone can't unplug you. And that actuator itself on the car was problematic. So if you look under the boot, and you can pull on a little toggle cord there, and that'll kind of release the mechanism. So there may be an option to unplug from the car, but it goes sort of further to the point of unexpected frustrations at the public charger. If there perhaps was a bit more information about what's just happened and what you need to do to resolve it, that would be great. Anyone got any other feedback on that?
I might add a couple of comments there. So what's commonly known as the CCS2 connector differs from the CHAdeMO connector in that the locking mechanism is actually on the connector side with the CHAdeMO. So that presents a bit of an issue because, you know, and look, you can do it from your app in a Tesla or most other EVs as well to hit the release button to release the connector from your vehicle. Unfortunately, for CHAdeMO equipped vehicles, that physical action lies on the connector and the charger side. So if there's a glitch or a communications issue between the vehicle and the charger, that's, I guess, one of the slightly less convenient aspects of the CHAdeMO standard. And look, if you can, again, I don't know what the options are about converting it over to CCS, but you know that might be one of the most straightforward ways of avoiding that problem in the future. But yeah, I certainly feel the pain. That's a horrible situation to be in.
Yeah, no, it's true that CHAdeMO is I wouldn't say it's on its way out. It's not dead. There's still plenty of people who are importing used Nissan Leafs from Japan. They're a fantastically cheap EV, and they all come with CHAdeMO plugs. So it's not unreasonable that we would expect some CHAdeMO plugs to persist in the community for at least another 5 or 6 years. But yeah, CCS or perhaps even NACS, the North American charging standard, which I don't think is likely to come to Australia, given that we've got a 3-phase network here. Yeah,
I wouldn't expect so. I mean, look, it certainly could happen. I mean, they've got a up to a megawatt standard with that standard that's now being deployed by most of the OEMs in the States. But look, Australia tends to follow Euro standards, and you can look at that from anywhere from our power infrastructure right through to our regulatory framework and everything. So, and that includes the CCS2 connector standard, which largely most of the OEMs have, or nearly all have adopted here in Australia. So
There's NACS won't come to Australia because Tesla get all the benefit of what they've got in NACS in the US. The biggest thing that we're going to have to watch out for is not so much the connector type, but the software integration that Tesla's going to do with the other vehicle manufacturers in the US, which will carry forward here in Australia. That's what they're really looking for. And so, yeah, I think a lot of the big public charging networks will have to watch out for that because the charging experience on the Tesla network will be pretty good, given that NACS also shares the same ISO 15118 protocol as CCS. So yeah, it won't come here, but they'll still get the benefit of it.
Yeah, well, that's probably a good follow-up question there from Stephen.
It's also, the hint is in the name. NACS stands for North American Charging Standards. So
yeah, they don't believe in sensible things like 3-phase power to the home. Just a follow-on question there from Stephen was will and how does the non-Tesla charging system, such as Noodoe or whatever, work with Tesla EVs? So I assume it's still the same standard though, is it?
Definitely still the same physical cable standard and the charging standard, but look, yeah, I'd love to have a chat to Elon and get an integration happening between Tesla and Noodoe and some of the other charging providers. Essentially, it will come back down to, and look, I think we'll get there eventually. I mean, as Tim mentioned, you know, they're looking at bringing certain protocols under support, and as they are with some of the OEMs in America, GM, Ford over there. So I would expect that to flow on here in Australia, and hopefully that'll carry across with certain charging networks. Obviously, we want to offer that same sort of seamless experience to Tesla vehicles as well as we do other OEMs. So it's certainly that's obviously pretty high on our list as well.
Yeah, cool. I might throw a question out to Jag. So Paul has just said, is it possible to have a queuing system built into apps so you could enter your rego, for example, and know who's next and how long your wait might need to be? This would be particularly useful for busy periods. Is that something that you guys have considered or looked into?
That's a really good question, Chris. And I think smart queuing or virtual queuing is something that's already, there are software providers in Europe that are testing or are rolling out that feature, and it's something that's definitely on our roadmap. The software and the protocol, and especially with the upcoming OCPP 2.0.1 protocol, it does allow the, feature, it does support these features. So it's definitely something that we want to provide to our users.
Just one thing to just jump in on that. Yeah, on OCPP supports reservations, as in reserving a spot for yourself. And what we've seen is it's like the one part of the OCPP protocol that nobody bothers with or implements. I can't say nobody, but in general, it's not really been taken up. I mean, just on the Tesla supercharger sort of at service stations in the UK, when you turn up, there's almost, the way the car park's designed is almost as though there will be one available, and you turn up, and generally there is, but there isn't always, and there isn't a queuing system built into the car parks at the moment. So we get into that sort of who was there before me, sort of everyone sort of, that Mexican standoff with people. Oh, I think he was there before me, but I'm not, like you get in a bar.
I believe the official protocol in Australia is to leave a $2 coin on the side.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Look, even with the base, even without a queuing system, the reservation feature, and we've implemented reservation within our platform and our clients, but it can be a bit difficult not from a software or a solution perspective, but just the actual act of reserving the charger, informing a user who wants to come up and use the charger, I'm sorry, this charger's been reserved. And then you wait for that person to turn up, and hopefully they turn up within the half an hour sort of grace.
Or there may be some timeout of 5 minutes or something like that. You snooze, you lose.
Yeah.
The other thing is you have to keep in mind is that, again, this is something that Global Networks has had the option to do for many, many years and have chosen not to do so. I think the biggest argument for not doing it is perception of people who don't drive EVs, because you can just imagine, if you got to use a charger, you got to queue up, and then you got to reserve it, and then you got to turn up on time, and then you can just imagine the FUD that'll get around if you implemented something like that by a big network. And so whilst I agree, I think it makes sense in some circumstances, I just don't want to see the press kind of like with these headlines go, well, you don't have to reserve a petrol station, so blah, blah, blah.
I think if you compare that to a scenario where there may, let's say, for example, any given school holiday or public holiday where the charges are going to be flat out, you may already have a physical queue formed. Now, if we've got queuing there with reservation feature built in, all of a sudden but I've got a reservation. I don't think the 3 people queued up are going to do that in the same same respect.
I think there's another sort of a new behavior, like a lot of parking, especially new shopping centers, they are already introducing parking, reserving a parking bay. So I think once the general public become more used to and aware to this new behavior, then it won't seem as sort of, like absurd or to non-EV drivers, because if they are used to that behavior already.
It's funny. I think there's definitely this interesting nexus where technology advances and gets to this point where human psychology hasn't caught up yet, and that's a really common frustration in the tech world, I realize.
Yeah, I think certainly car parks, and look, give it a few years, 5 years, we're going to see a lot of car parks where there's probably going to be more car parking spaces with electric vehicle chargers than not. sooner or later. So when it comes to, and in between that time, that's where a reservation feature can really solve some of those problems, particularly around managing access to those car parks and reserving.
Cool. Well, I might jump on. Riz has just asked, what are the panelists' thoughts on hardware with very thick and heavy cables on certain models of DC charger? And is accessibility a key area where we should really be focusing on this early in the EV adoption curve? What do folks think?
Well, the reason they're thick and heavy is just the function of the amount of copper and cooling necessary on high power chargers, and that's partly down to the voltage that it is down to the voltage the battery packs are running at, and versus the actual power of the charger. And there is a move for chargers to go on to higher voltages, which would mean that the cables in theory could be not as heavy. But this is at the moment, because you've got lots of cars, 400 volt battery packs, and the chargers are getting ever more powerful, and there's a push to make them more powerful. Those cables are going to stay heavy. It's just a sort of a physics issue, basically. But I guess the question is about, okay, so given that, how do people who aren't strong and handle those cables? So yeah, somebody else might have some comments on that in terms of design of DC chargers.
Yeah, and I think this is an issue, right? Because you kind of go, well, we should be rolling out 300 amp cables minimum with DC charging so we can actually get close to the nameplate advertised speed. Alpatronic even advertised 400 amp non-liquid cooled cables, which is fucking huge, right? And impossible to move. And so, in the absence of that, I think it comes down to the cable management system. And I think that's why like the Kempower systems are really popular, is because they've actually really thought about the cable size, and they try and make it a bit easier by having that huge spring loaded thing. Most of the charging stations that you see either have really bad cable management systems, or worse, no cable management systems. They just lie on the ground and you just like got to pick them up. From an accessibility perspective, my belief is that any government contributed, because otherwise it's very hard to enforce, right? But any government contributed public charging network in the future needs to have accessibility in mind. And I really support what they're doing in the US, which is to align it with the US disability standards. I think that's really, really important. The biggest issue we have at the moment is that the networks themselves don't own the car parks. Often they're begging landlords for car parks. And if they try and get the landlords to make any changes to the car park, the landlord's not too hard, go away. And so that is a real problem. And then if you consider petrol station forecourts, for example, which if they're not on the highway already have such limited parking spaces, again, it's hard. And you obviously don't want to take the disabled bay, obviously. So yeah, all of those things make it very difficult. But I do think after the first kind of like bit of charging networks have been rolled out, anything that comes after this, you need to have it in, you need to take it into account.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we've certainly been working closely with the WAEV networks during the planning stage, was to make sure that we had as many sort of at level, not up on a hard stand sort of charging infrastructure, so that someone in a wheelchair could still get around and activate the equipment without great difficulty. And there was a question here about service level agreements with public funding, and I think that ties into it as well. If we're going to be spending public money on charging infrastructure, then I think there would be a sort of expectation that some sort of maintenance and accessibility would be built into that contract. I guess it really depends on the specific arrangements, but it would certainly make sense that if it's accepting public money to get built, then you would meet some fairly straightforward minimums around accessibility. So just conscious of the time, I might quickly jump to Jude's question here. Jude is really keen to know what is on the horizon with respect to public charging that excites you all the most. Anyone can jump in.
I think I might shoot a couple of things in there.
Without revealing too much, obviously.
Yeah, I've got to be a look. I think with respect to Australia, we've got some significant challenge, and I love a good challenge. We've got some significant challenges to solve, you know, outside of the general public charging sphere in terms of generation, transmission. You know, those are some fairly heady problems that, you know, are not going to take they're going to take a significant amount of time to solve. In the meantime, you know, when we start looking at charging sites that are having issues accessing the connection, or the connection requests are being denied or cut down from the market operators, it's about plugging those gaps. You know, looking at solar and battery and how we manage that cohesively with the energy provider as well. There's a protocol called Open ADR, or essentially Open Demand Response, where, you know, networks can actually integrate with energy companies so that we can better manage the available energy in the grid in certain locations throughout times of peak demand, etc., and essentially potentially participate in trading and that sort of stuff. So I think that space is going to be very, very interesting in how we look at solving some of those problems that are quite particular in Australia's environment, particularly in remote areas. But again, you know, I'll be very excited when we can start rolling out plug and charge and auto charge and get that great user experience right across the whole EV fleet, you know, agnostic of the model that you're driving. You know, that to me is just a great user experience. It's, yeah, very exciting.
Yeah, what excites you, Tim?
Aggregation of public charging networks through a not-for-profit, with all due respect to everyone who's trying to integrate with every single charging network. The reality is that people have been, I would say, doing that for the past 5 years. And I think every time that it's a for-profit, everyone gets very suspicious. And so I think it has to be not-for-profit or government that brings it all together and then basically licenses the data to third-party aggregators who want to use that data. So I would really love to see that happen. I think it's required for consumer experience. That's the first thing, and I think it will happen. And so that's the first thing I'm really excited about. Second thing is ubiquitous credit cards on all public charging sites. And that doesn't rule out, I think, you know, Sam's model of having QR codes. It doesn't rule out apps. It just basically means that for people who are traveling from overseas or interstate or whatever, you know, there's just credit card, just bloody use the credit card.
Yeah, and that's something that, and like the WAEV network is really keen to get tourists to fly into Perth and hire an EV. We want you to fly into Perth and hire an EV and go for a drive up the coast. And if you've come from overseas, your credit card or your phone probably won't work with any of the apps.
Oh, yeah, the amount of issues we've had with people with overseas app stores and stuff not being able to access Australian apps is just mind-blowing. It's very annoying. And then the third thing I'm really excited about, but this may be a little bit further in the future, is wireless DC charging. Well, wireless AC charging's not too far away, but high-powered wireless DC charging might take a little bit longer. And I think once we get to that level, I think that'll be really exciting. But that's quite a bit away from full commercialization, as in like at the factory floor from the vehicle manufacturers. I think retrofits will happen a bit sooner. And then, and sorry, the last one that I'm really excited about, I don't know if I'm excited or nervous or both, is battery swapping making a comeback. And if NEO ever enters the country, I think we'll see that, and we'll see what people's reaction to that is. And then a lot of the battery manufacturers, as well as some startups out of the US and Europe, looking to revive that. I think mostly curious to see where it's going to end up and what the mix of battery swapping and public charging is.
Very neat. Yes, it's. I've always thought that motorcycles and scooters would be a prime candidate because it's a manageable, massive battery. But you know, giant car batteries is a bit of a different proposition. How about you, Kyle? What do you think? What excites you about the future of charging?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I have to call back to this aggregation thing. I mean, I guess how it happens doesn't matter, but ultimately the fact is it does need to happen for the user, and that's really, I think, the biggest thing. And yeah, I think this idea of retrofitting, there's a lot of embodied energy in existing vehicles, and if there's an idea that we can, you know, make that more consistently achievable, we can actually decarbonize what the industry is doing now, by producing more cars. So I think that's something that's quite exciting moving forward.
Yeah,
well.
I'm pretty confident that Graham and Francisco have already come up with a solution for it in their shed. So,
Yeah.
Jag, how about you?
I think a lot of the stuff that I'm excited about has already been shared. The only thing that I would say is the vehicle to grid technology, especially considering the amount of sun we get in Australia and what Sam was saying about integration with renewable energy. I think V2G technology, it's something that I'm really looking forward to, and see how, I know it's heavily regulated in Europe, which is obviously miles ahead in terms of EV adoption. And again, how it will play out in the Australian market is yet to be seen, but technology wise, that's something that does excite me, besides what has already been shared.
Yeah. And Dunstan, what do you reckon?
Oh, well, for me, it's probably just a bit more mundane. We've got this government standard that's just come out this year, and that's aiming to solve a bunch of the problems that we've talked about. And the main issue really is that just about the payments, which you guys have discussed, and obviously there's solutions in the panelists here, but at the moment we've got far too many charge point operators in the UK. God knows, it's probably like 50, and they've all got their own apps. We've discussed this, and so the government has mandated now that all fast chargers have to have a be open to everybody without having an app. So effectively, everyone's going to have to put payment terminals, and it's involving actually retrofitting existing chargers as well as new chargers. So it's a real headache for people who make chargers, because the government come along and say, right, you've just got to do this, and their initial standards said, oh, you've got to do it by July or something, having announced it in January. Of course, all the engineers said, well, that's basically impossible, so they've pushed that back a year. But I think just being able to turn up at any charger and just being able to use contactless payments on it, it seems like quite a small ask. And I know the guys have discussed this quite a bit on this talk, but that actually for me is the thing that probably excites me the most at the moment.
I think it depends. It depends how you pay for that via credit card. Because I mean, look, just from a sake of simplicity, you know, having another physical device that potentially can fail, which would be quite likely a single point of failure. Doing it via software, offering credit card without the need to sign up for an account and all that sort of stuff is perfectly achievable. We do it, so it's, you know, you can offer that same level of functionality without having that additional need for an additional, you know, credit card terminal with an additional SIM service and all that infrastructure and potential, you know.
Well, that's what's been mandated though, is to have effectively contactless payment. So that's the way the UK is going on it.
Yeah, and the potential to collect vast quantities of information. Well, I mean, that's just more bandwidth you need to provide comms for, and it's more complicated. I mean, you know, it's not as simple as just pumping a liquid out of a reservoir, you know.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we'd all like that Tesla plug and charge experience where you just, again, I'm a Tesla driver, you just turn up, plug in and walk in. But as we've all been discussing, that's because Tesla's got a closed network. They're able to make that so seamless. But, you know, the utopia would be to have that for everybody, regardless of what car you're driving, regardless of what charger you arrive at.
I might just quickly go to Kathleen's question here. She's asking if there's any Australian standard or overarching regulation covering charging infrastructure, such as safety systems, pricing limits, consumer expectations, etc. And if not, how are government and OEMs working together on this? So perhaps those who are involved in the coalface might have an answer for that.
Yeah, there's regulation covering electrical safety, which is AS 3000. There's regulation covering equipment certification, which is in Australia RCM, which kind of mostly follows the European standards. There's regulation regarding communications, credit card if there is one. There's heaps of them, but there is no regulation in relation to pricing for the electric vehicle charging, because electric vehicle charging falls outside of the Electricity Retail Act. There's also currently no standard for DC measurement for electric vehicle charging and electricity consumption. All of that will come. At the moment, it's basically if you charge too much, you get an article written about you in the Driven, and they whack you over the head, and then you try and kind of backpedal. It's trial by Coliseum, I guess.
Yeah, I believe that the electricity pricing regulations in Western Australia specifically exclude electric vehicle charging. So you don't need to be an electricity retailer to have an EV charge point, because the current legislation requires that. So there is an exception there. But no, the other one, it would be around accessibility and that kind of stuff. So we've got regulations around provision of accessible parking. It's only a matter of time before that's extended to EV charging stations, I would imagine.
I think over time, I'd love to see a similar approach to accessible charging bays as to what we have with standard, accessible car parks in most areas. And I guess over time, with volume of infrastructure that will come, I think, but how we do that in the meantime is probably a problem that needs to be looked at.
I might quickly jump on. There's another question here for Dunstan. Is the UK is a great place for an EV day trip? Is there any evidence indicating that the tourism industry could be a stronger ally for advocating for the installation of chargers where people actually want to visit?
So it's an interesting one, really, in terms of if you have a hotel and you actually put in chargers now, that there's very few hotels doing that, and the hospitality industry seems, in the UK, I'm speaking, it seems to be a little bit behind the curve. So what's happening is we're seeing people running Airbnbs and things like that now waking up to the fact that people are turning up, they're hanging charging cables out the window, and then they're charging, and they're paying. Yeah. And particularly with energy prices as high as they are, you've paid £70 for the night for some sort of low cost place, and then you've put a sort of £30 electricity bill on it. So I think the hospitality sector certainly in the UK really needs to catch up, and there's very few hotels that have EV chargers. There's very few sort of cottages, restaurants. The public charging at the moment in the UK is mostly at motorway service stations and petrol stations, and then sporadically town councils stick them in sort of sporadically in car parks. So I think there's a real opportunity for the hospitality industry to get one over on their competitors by putting EV chargers in, installing them, and then pricing them at a sort of a reasonable level, not offering free charging necessarily, but and at the moment they're behind the curve. So if you get in there, it gives you a real leg up versus other hotels in the area.
Yeah, I think road trip tourism it's very popular. I can say for certain it's very popular over here in Western Australia, because if you want to visit something interesting, you're up for a road trip. Not to say that Perth's a boring city, it's absolutely not, but all of the picture postcard stuff is a good 4 hour or plus drive away. So I think that there will be a lot of really good crossover with tourism and EV charging. Yeah, absolutely. And that coincides with being able to rent an EV when you fly into a destination.
I mean, again, you've got the issue of density of charging in the UK. I just flick this up. It's a map of so for the UK, this is just like a map of the density, and basically dark blue is good and green is bad. And what you can see is sort of Scotland, which is got a low population, has actually got quite a decent rapid charger density because per population, whereas Wales, so I'm looking at tourist areas in the UK for anyone who's coming over to the UK on holiday. Wales and Scotland probably two of the more beautiful parts of the country. Wales is terrible, absolutely terrible. So if you want to go driving around Wales in an EV, I'd say don't, basically, unless you want to be on a tow truck. Again, the Lake District, Cumbria, the beautiful parts of the country are really poor. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do, and from it's the cities where you've got really good density, but the some of the more beautiful places, it's pretty weak at the moment. So
cool. Well, I might start to wrap it up. We've already been at it for an hour now, but I think Jamie's question here is a pretty good one to finish up on. He asks, what do you see as a real blocker for the further rollout of charging infrastructure? What's the number one headache that's just holding things up, and what can we do about it?
That's going to be an easy one. That's going to be grid constraints.
Yep.
Will be the number one blocker, and I think most people know that. Yeah. I think a very close second is a viable business case. Is number two.
Yeah.
But yeah, grid blocker. And what we're seeing, my understanding, Dunstan, is in the UK is with so many charging networks, the DNOs are not necessarily keeping up either with the applications, even if there is kind of room on the grid. And I think for me, the problem we have in Australia, and I think globally as well, is we haven't hit the really hard part yet. So what I mean by that is we haven't hit the 15 to 20 meg sites for truck charging. We haven't hit the 50 bay sites that we're seeing in like China, for example, or the 100 bay sites that we're seeing. We haven't hit those really hard bits yet, where we're talking like serious medium voltage networks, similar to running like universities and aluminium plants, and like how are we supposed, it's going to require a lot of work. But the close collaboration with the networks, I think one of the biggest issues is that there's a bit of an us and them mentality sometimes between the charging networks and the distribution networks. The reality is that the charging networks will not be successful without a harmonious relationship with the distribution networks. So I think that's why, for example, with the WA Highway, Western Power's involvement was really, really important. So yeah, I think that'll be the biggest challenge.
Yeah. Cool. Sam, what do you reckon?
Look, I think no, Tim covered that fairly well, and I think a lot of the problem, well, not necessarily the problem, is definitely working very closely with the energy companies to ensure that they can get the connections that are required. And look, I've heard of a number of instances where that's been the case. But again, there's solutions outside of the sphere of grid connection as well, which I think is going to be more forthcoming over the next few years, which is going to be exciting to watch. But look, a lot of it's going to be, I think, particularly for the short term, based on a lot of public funding, which we're already seeing as part of the rollout. But I think the commercials around it are going to have to change in the short term to encourage. And look, at the end of the day, we all want to see more charging infrastructure out there. This, at some point, does need to be profitable. So, look, hopefully over time, we can work on lower energy prices to help keep those costs down. But I would say at some point we're going to start to see the prices for public chargers, certainly the ultra fast chargers, increase, just to encourage, I guess, a bit of profitability over the long term. But I guess that's probably part of the. And again, much like it is for OEMs in Australia, from a vehicle supply perspective, it's also going to come down to supply charges as that demand increases in line with electric vehicle adoption. So,
yeah, I think if I might just answer part of that question, what we're seeing is a lot of people buying a brand new BYD or a Tesla and being handed a 10 amp granny charger, and they're going, right, I'm going to cross the Nullarbor, and you know, Ant or myself gets a phone call saying, oh, what do I do now? I think the car retailers are struggling to convey that handover of information and knowledge that, let's face it, as regular EV drivers, we're very comfortable with, but we didn't get there instantly. It took time. And I think that level of education is going to be a really important thing that needs to happen before, during, and after the handover of that new vehicle.
Yeah, I personally have to say that I'm a little bit disappointed in seeing a lot of the OEMs start to remove those mobile chargers as a default inclusion. I understand the challenges around reducing cost, but I just think it's a bargain, no-brainer default piece of kit that you've got to include, and add that to your Type 2 cable, Type 2 to Type 2 cable.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I just say we've had some sort of bad publicity in the UK with EV, with a few sort of celebrity, high-profile people who have basically bought Teslas, and so Rowan Atkinson's one of them, so Blackadder. So he wrote this piece which got a lot of publicity because he'd bought a Tesla, and then basically he was sort of relying on public infrastructure, and another fairly high-profile journalist did the same thing, and they wrote pieces basically saying, oh, EVs are terrible. And you read the article and you think, well, you don't have a home charger, and these are guys who probably have mansions. They can have a home charger.
They've probably got their own substation.
Yeah, got their own substation, and they're basically buying these spending £80,000 on a high-end Tesla, and then they're basically not charging it, and they're expecting to do it all on public chargers. And and then they write puff pieces in sort of right-wing media about it. And
I think if you're familiar with Rowan Atkinson's frequent appearances on Top Gear with his mate Jeremy Clarkson, you can put that in the frame that it's
exactly
comes across as
exactly
maybe a slight little level of bias there. But,
he likes 4 exhaust pipes, basically. Yeah.
And how about you, Jag, Kyle? What's what are you experiencing, at least at the software end of things?
Kyle, I think it's a question for our CTO, but I've seen him banging his head almost banging his head against the wall when it comes to this hardware that's out there already, and the protocol. Like you're having to work with multiple different protocols, and then some of the points that have been raised tonight around the work that Tesla's doing, and there's still a lot of uncertainty around how things are going to play out in the long term when it comes to the underlying protocols that are connecting, that are enabling the communication between the softwares and the hardware. So we think, I don't necessarily see that as a big blocker, but there is definitely some uncertainty there. I think we are moving in the right direction with standardization. And when you look at the recent specifications that came up with the ChargeUp grant and other government grants, the government bodies are becoming, policymakers are becoming more and more aware. And they are actually, putting that as requirements, that the charger or any hardware that's being approved is approved and meets the minimum criteria. So other than everything that's been said, I think from a software point of view, the underlying protocols and the uncertainty around it, and the more standardization we can have, the better end user experience we can offer. And what Tim was referring to around e-roaming, I think the sooner we get to that future, the sooner we can have that aggregation, integration among different networks, the better it will be for the end user.
Yeah, I suppose just to add, it all just comes down to information and the clarity of that information from the user point of view. I mean, we all are coming from a petrol network, essentially. We all come from a scenario where you just rock up. So being able to clearly identify and understand what the system is and how that works is really the software, I suppose, from my point of view, how that needs to clearly articulate what needs to happen for a consumer. So yeah.
Ooh. Awesome. Well, it's probably getting late over east. It's certainly dinner time here in the west, but well, lunchtime for Dunstan.
Yes.
So thank you very, very much for everybody for joining our panel, and thank you to everyone for dialing in and listening. Like I said, the recording of this will be put up on our AEVA YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that that's available to anyone who wants. I'll also do a quick copy paste of all of the questions here, and make sure that gets circulated amongst our panel. And well, thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Great.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah,
Thanks,
right.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Yes, bye. Bye.
See you guys.